Isabella Martinez had thought the worst part of tonight would be singing to a nearly empty bar. She was wrong. When she refused the wrong man, he returned with two others to teach her a lesson. They dragged her into a dark alley, shattered her ankle, and left her bleeding in the cold night. Isabella begged the shadow moving toward her not to hurt her anymore. But Vincent Romano had not come to hurt her. The Italian crime boss, owner of the nightclub where she sang, had come to destroy every man who had laid a hand on her. It was close to 2 o'clock in the morning in New Orleans. The Velvet Note, a cozy jazz bar tucked away in the old French Quarter, had only a few late drinkers left, lingering over their last sips of bourbon. On the small wooden stage, Isabella Martinez stood alone, an old microphone in her hand, her quiet voice drifting through the smoky air like mist, echoing faintly with the sorrow of Billie Holiday. She had sung here for 8 months, 5 nights a week, always the last to leave the stage, carrying home a dream that never felt close enough to touch. Each time she counted her tips after a show, her heart tightened when the total fell short of the rent and the tuition for the vocal class she longed to attend. Tonight, she earned only $23. When the old clock behind the bar struck 1:45, the last customer rose, paid, and slipped out into the night. Isabella gathered her money, pulled on her coat, thanked the bartender, and stepped outside. The November wind swept against her collar, sharp and cold, carrying the damp scent of the Mississippi River and the greasy smell of fried food from a late-night vendor parked nearby. Her apartment was only 6 blocks away. She had walked this route hundreds of times and never had any reason to be afraid. But tonight felt different. As she turned onto a narrow, empty street, she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, urgent, more than one pair. Isabella's hand slipped into her coat pocket, brushing her phone. A man's voice came from behind, cold and familiar. "There she is. Thought you could humiliate me and walk away, huh?" She turned. 3 men. The one in the middle, she recognized instantly. Harrison Blackwell III, 32 years old, the son of a state senator, a spoiled heir of the political elite. 3 weeks earlier, he had tried to flirt with her at the bar, spewing crude words and ignoring her refusals. Isabella had raised her voice and told him to leave, right there in front of his friends. He had walked out, face flushed with rage. She should have known he would come back. "I don't want trouble," Isabella said, keeping her voice steady, her hand still gripping her phone. "I just want to go home. You made a fool of me." Harrison stepped closer, his breath heavy with alcohol and arrogance. "You think you're better than me. I think I have the right to say no." Isabella took a step back. The other 2 men fanned out, blocking her path. "Wrong answer." Harrison's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist and twisting it hard. Isabella screamed, tore free, and ran. She managed only a few yards before she was yanked backward. Rough hands ripped her coat. A fist slammed into her face, and the world went black around the edges. They dragged her into a narrow alley reeking of garbage and broken glass. She screamed, kicked, begged, but the only reply was laughter and blows. Harrison's shoe came down on her foot with a sickening crack. Isabella screamed until her voice broke. Her ankle was snapped, the pain so blinding she could feel nothing else but terror and disbelief. They beat her until she could no longer move, then left her there on the cold cement, writhing in agony, blood trickling from her mouth, her ankles swollen grotesquely, her phone shattered beside her. She thought she would die there alone in the dark for daring to say no to the wrong man. But then came another sound of footsteps, heavier, slower. Isabella tried to open her eyes, her vision blurred with tears and blood. A figure approached, tall and broad-shouldered. She whispered, her voice no more than a fading breath. "Please, I can't walk. Don't hurt me anymore." The shadow stopped. It knelt beside her. A hand, surprisingly gentle, lifted her face. The dim yellow light from the street lamp revealed the man's features. His dark blue eyes widened in horror as he recognized her. "Isabella." His voice was with anger, with shock. "God, what happened to you?" She knew that face. She had seen him many times at the bar, sitting quietly at the back, listening as she sang. The man who never spoke, but whose gaze never left her. Vincent Romano, owner of the Velvet Note, a name people mentioned only in whispers, wrapped in fear and respect. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. 3 men, Harrison, he. but the words would not form. Vincent's eyes swept over her bruised, broken body, his expression darkening into something cold and terrible. His breath came heavy. "I'm taking you to a doctor right now. Hold on. It's going to hurt." He lifted her in his arms, careful as though she might shatter. Isabella cried out in pain and let her head fall against his shoulder. For a moment, there was nothing but the warmth of the man carrying her. She should have been afraid, but all she felt was gratitude that someone had come, that someone cared enough to help her, and that someone was Vincent Romano, the man everyone feared, the man who would soon make those 3 names the last anyone would dare to speak. If you have listened this far, thank you for sharing your time and your heart with us through every pulse of this story. And if something within you feels tight, stirred, or aching, perhaps you understand Isabella, someone who once believed that good things were never meant for her until they arrived unannounced and full of grace. Do not forget to subscribe, to like, and to share this story with those you love, so that we may continue telling moments that reach the deepest corners of emotion. Stories of lives, of turning points, of truth disguised as fiction yet filled with meaning. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell us the city, the state, or the country where you are, so we may know how far the story of Isabella and Vincent has traveled, how many streets it has crossed, how many hearts in need of healing it has found hearts like yours. Thank you for being here, and we hope you will stay with us for what comes next. Vincent's arms tightened around Isabella as he carried her out of the alley, his steps heavy against the hiss of the midnight wind and the dim glow of street lights that fell across the cold concrete. She no longer had the strength to ask where he was taking her. The pain coursing through her body blurred into one endless ache, part fear, part wound. Vincent's face was still, but in those deep blue eyes burned a fury so quiet and consuming that he did not need to speak. The very air around him seemed to thicken with it. He crossed 2 blocks, the echo of his black leather shoes steady on the worn brick pavement of the French Quarter. A black SUV waited before an unmarked building. The driver, dressed in a dark suit, opened the rear door without being told. Vincent gently placed Isabella on the seat, draped his coat over her trembling body, and climbed in beside her without a single word. The car moved through the stillness of the night, turning into a narrow street where a 3-story building stood, its brass name plate bearing the name of a doctor few had ever heard of. Vincent carried her inside, and within minutes, a middle-aged man with a stern face appeared. He asked no questions, only glanced briefly at Isabella before nodding at Vincent, as if long accustomed to emergencies that required silence more than inquiry. Isabella was laid on a bed in a small white room that smelled sharply of antiseptic. She could barely open her eyes. The ceiling above her swam in and out of focus, cold and pain and panic twisting together like a storm with no exit. The doctor examined her injuries one by one. A severely broken ankle, 3 cracked ribs, deep bruises along her hip and abdomen, a torn corner of her mouth, and dark marks circling her neck and arms. He injected her with a strong dose of painkiller, and within moments, the world began to fade, growing lighter, quieter, as if she were drifting away from herself. But before she slipped fully into the haze of sleep, she turned her head and saw Vincent still standing there, silent as stone, his dark eyes heavy with a storm, waiting to break. When Isabella awoke, dawn had begun to seep through the curtains. The first light of day poured across the ceiling in a soft wash of amber. She was lying in a warm room with clean white sheets, soft pillows, and a folded blanket that smelled faintly of linen. Her ankle was secured in a brace, her ribs wrapped in bandages, a drip line feeding into her left arm. The air was so still it felt fragile until she heard the scrape of a chair beside the bed. Vincent sat there, still in the same suit from the night before, his shirt collar undone, his hair slightly tousled. He watched her without speaking, leaning forward a little. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and raw. He reached for the glass of water on the table and handed it to her. Isabella took a few sips, then looked at him for a long time. "You stayed here all night." Her voice was. Vincent nodded, his gaze softening, though tension lingered beneath the calm. "The doctor said you slept almost 8 hours. The painkillers were strong." She gripped the edge of the blanket, forcing herself to remember. The flashes came back in fragments. The laughter of 3 men, The reek of alcohol, the sound of bones snapping, her own scream breaking into silence. The images were blurred and warped, but sharp enough to make her body tremble. It was Harrison Blackwell, she whispered, steadying her breath. With two others, I don't know their names, but I remember their faces. Vincent said nothing for a few seconds. Then he rose, walked to the window, and looked outside. The room fell into deep silence, filled only with the wild thudding of her heartbeat. When I heard you scream, he said finally, his voice low, rough. I was at the corner, 3 buildings away. I never take that route home, but last night I was walking after a meeting, planning to hear your last song before leaving. He turned back, his eyes burning with a restrained fire. I heard you call out, and I ran. Isabella looked at him, her chest tightening. She didn't know how to thank him enough. You saved me, she whispered. If you hadn't been there. Vincent stepped closer and sat at the edge of the bed. He took her hand in his rough fingers, closing around hers with surprising gentleness. Isabella, what happened last night cannot be left unanswered. You're under my roof. You sing in my bar. That means you're under my protection, and I don't let anyone touch what's mine without paying for it. Her heart clenched, torn between fear and something dangerously close to gratitude. Fear because she knew who he was. Gratitude because he hadn't turned away, and she understood in the moment he lifted her from that dark pavement that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Vincent Romano asked no questions as Isabella told him what had happened, and he didn't interrupt even once during the 10 long minutes it took for her to gather the fragments of memory and recount every cruel thing the 3 men had done to her in that alley. At times she faltered, her voice cracking. At others the tears came unbidden, slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. Yet Vincent's eyes never left her. There was no pity in them, only focus, pure and absolute, as if every word she spoke was a piece of a puzzle he was determined to complete. When she said the name Harrison Blackwell, he froze. A shadow passed through the deep blue of his eyes, and the hand resting on his thigh curled slowly into a fist. Still, he said nothing. He simply placed his hand over hers, firm and steady, a silent promise beneath his touch. When she finished, the space between them thickened, charged like the edge of a storm waiting to strike. Vincent stood and moved toward the window, where the early sky was turning gold with the rise of the sun. Isabella didn't know what he was thinking, nor did she dare to ask. All she knew was that this man who had barely spoken 3 sentences to her in 8 months had been the only one there when she thought she would die alone in the dark. And that changed everything. When Vincent turned back to her, the softness in his expression was gone. His face had hardened, his voice low, firm, and edged with an icy resolve. Those men will answer for what they did to you. I promise you that. They will regret ever laying a hand on you, and they will never touch anyone again. Isabella stared at him, her heart thudding against her ribs. She wanted to ask what he meant, what he planned to do, but the words died on her lips. She could see it in his eyes, the cold calculation of a man accustomed to solving problems in ways ordinary people never would. Vincent Romano was not ordinary. He was dangerous, powerful, and completely, utterly focused on her. And for the first time in her life, Isabella Martinez felt protected by the very darkness everyone else feared. That promise was not a chain. It was a place to rest, and if she needed it, a refuge without demand or condition. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she lifted her hand and touched his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heart, and he understood. They sat there together beneath the night sky of New Orleans, where the stars were dimmed by city lights, but still existed, still shimmered if one knew how to look for them. So were they 2 people marked by scars, sitting not to forget what they had lost, but to believe that they could begin again, slowly, gently, and truthfully. The first kiss didn't change the world, but it opened a small door, one through which hope could touch the light. And in that light, Isabella knew she had allowed herself to believe once more not in love, but in a person, a man named Vincent Romano. The next morning, Isabella awoke to sunlight spilling softly through the curtains, the wool scarf from the night before still draped across her shoulders. Vincent was no longer in the room, but the faint warmth left in the chair beside her bed told her he had stayed there through the night, guarding her sleep. Her ankle was still weak, but the pain had eased, soothed by medication and careful rest. Vincent's private doctor arrived at noon, nodding with quiet satisfaction after watching her take a few slow, steady steps with assistance. He said she could start walking with crutches as long as she moved slowly and had someone nearby. Vincent stood beside her, arms crossed, his gaze intent, but carrying a trace of restrained relief. When the doctor left, he turned toward her, a small smile curving his lips. Ready for a small challenge? Isabella blinked. What kind of challenge? Vincent walked over, retrieving the pair of sleek crutches standing by the door, and placed them in front of her. Shopping. She laughed for the first time in days. You're kidding. I never kid, he said, a faint spark of mischief lighting his eyes. You need clothes, shoes, everything. You can't keep wearing hospital pajamas and my shirts forever. Isabella glanced down at the soft clothes she was wearing, comfortable, perfectly chosen, but not quite hers. I don't have much money, she murmured hesitantly. Vincent paused, then sat beside her, his tone low and firm. I didn't ask if you had money. I asked if you needed something. This isn't charity, Isabella. This is me wanting to do something for you. Don't refuse me. She looked at him, ready to protest, but stopped and simply nodded. Maybe this time she needed to learn how to let herself receive. The black SUV carried them to a quiet boutique nestled on a leafy street in the Garden District. The staff clearly knew Vincent. They asked no questions, only smiled politely, offering Isabella a velvet chair, a glass of water with lemon, and a series of carefully chosen outfits. Vincent never strayed far, yet he didn't interfere. He simply observed, nodding occasionally when she stepped out in a pale sea-green dress or a long cream coat that framed her small figure. At first, Isabella felt awkward, uncertain, but gradually she began to smile more, her eyes brightening with a spark of life she hadn't realized was missing. When she emerged in a simple black midi dress with a modest neckline, Vincent stood, walked toward her, and for a moment it felt as if the entire room vanished. That one suits you, he said softly. It makes you look like yourself again. Not a victim, a woman who knows who she is. Isabella felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the strange, quiet power of being seen. Truly seen. When they left the boutique, Isabella carried 3 large bags and a smile that hadn't yet faded. Vincent helped her into the car, adjusted her crutches so she could sit comfortably, then slid into the seat beside her. On the way back, they spoke little, letting the soft jazz from the speakers and the whisper of wind against the windows fill the silence. But between them lingered a new kind of connection between the rescued and the rescuer, but between two people slowly finding each other through the smallest, most ordinary moments. When the car pulled into the underground garage, Vincent turned to her and gently took her hand. Today wasn't about the things you bought. It was about you. Stepped outside, faced the light, faced yourself. And I'm proud of you. Isabella looked at him, her heart swelling with something warm and tight all at once. She squeezed his hand lightly, then whispered, I'm proud, too, that I had the courage to walk beside you. Vincent didn't speak, but the slow nod and the look in his eyes told her enough. He would be the rain no matter how long or hard the road ahead, and this time, she wouldn't have to walk it alone. 3 days after that first shopping trip, Isabella sat before the tall mirror in her bedroom, her fingers brushing through the soft waves of hair freshly curled around her shoulders. She wore a cream-colored wrap dress that traced her figure, now steadier after weeks of recovery. Her ankle was still braced, but she could stand for several minutes on her own with the help of crutches, and today she needed that strength. Today wasn't an ordinary day. Today she would sing, not at the Velvet Note, not before the half-distracted patrons sipping their late-night drinks, but before the artistic board of a renowned jazz club in the heart of the French Quarter, the same stage that had once belonged to the legends of New Orleans. The man who had arranged the audition was Vincent. She had found out only 2 mornings earlier when he placed an envelope in front of her containing an official invitation signed and sealed. They're looking for a singer to open the new season, he'd said as if it were nothing at all. I sent them your recording. They want to hear you live. Isabella had stared at the letter for a long time before looking up at him. Why would you do that? Because your voice doesn't belong inside 4 walls, he answered, his tone certain. You survived, Isabella. You stepped out of the dark. Now it's time the light finds you. Now sitting beside him in the car, her hands felt cold with nerves. He reached over and clasped one, giving it a gentle squeeze. Breathe. You don't have to prove anything. Just do what you always do. Tell your story through your voice. Isabella nodded, her heart restless but alive. She had once thought dreams like standing on a grand stage were impossible, almost foolish. But now, as the SUV glided through the glowing streets of New Orleans, that dream no longer felt distant. It was right there, waiting. The audition room was on the third floor of a historic red brick building with high glass windows. When Vincent helped her out of the car, his eyes were steady and sure, filled with a quiet protectiveness that said without words that no matter what happened, she wouldn't face it alone. Inside, the room was spacious and softly lit. A piano stood to the left of the small stage. 3 people sat in the front row. An older woman with silver hair and glasses, an Asian man in a dark brown suit, and a younger black man flipping through her file. Isabella stood at the center of the stage, her hands gripping her crutch, drawing in a deep breath. The younger man looked up and smiled slightly. Miss Martinez, whenever you're ready. She nodded and signaled to the pianist. The song she chose was one she had sung hundreds of times at last, not to impress, but because it had carried her through the darkest nights. She needed to remember why she had begun. The first notes floated through the air, and when she began to sing, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every word, every tremor in her voice carried a piece of what she had survived. Pain, fear, resilience, and that fragile thread of hope that had kept her alive. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was simply telling the truth. When the final note faded, silence followed for several seconds. Then the silver-haired woman spoke first. I don't know what you've been through, she said softly, but I know you've lived it. And your voice gave me chills. The man in the brown suit nodded. Your voice has depth, something you can't learn. It only comes from those who've lost and overcome. The third man smiled. We'll be in touch very soon. But personally, I think we've just found our opening act. Isabella didn't reply. She only smiled, her lips trembling, her eyes shining with tears. She refused to let fall. When she stepped off the stage, Vincent was already waiting near the door. He didn't speak, only offered his hand. As they reached the car, he opened the door, helped her inside, then looked at her for a long moment. I told you, he said with a quiet grin. You're not just a singer. You're the story people need to hear. Isabella looked back at him, her eyes glistening. I don't think I could have done it without you. Always could, he said. I just turned the light back on. She leaned her head against the seat, her heart swelling with emotion. The audition wasn't just the beginning of a career. It was the threshold of another life, a life she had chosen not to live in fear, not in darkness, but in the open, where her voice could finally be heard. And this time it was her own voice, the one that had almost been silenced forever. A week after the audition, Isabella stood behind the curtain of the largest stage she had ever dreamed of. The Lumiere Jazz Club, nestled in the heart of the French Quarter, was legendary for its vibrant nights, and for the long line of artists who had once begun their journeys there, a list as rich as a vinyl record of jazz history itself. This time her name appeared at the very end of the performance bill, new but introduced with respect. Isabella Martinez, the woman whose voice could silence a room. They called her a singer reborn after tragedy. But only Vincent knew the truth hidden beneath the silk gown she wore that night. The black dress traced her slender frame, the soft fabric gliding over collarbones and shoulders that had once borne the weight of survival. Isabella stared at her reflection in the tall mirror backstage, one hand resting gently at her throat, as if to remind herself that the voice was still there, that tonight she would let it live again. Vincent approached, his perfectly tailored black suit cutting sharply through the backstage crowd. Yet his eyes found only her, as though everything else had faded to gray. He said nothing, only extended his hand. Isabella took it, her palm cold, and he didn't let go. His fingers tightened around hers, just enough to say without words, I'm here always. When the announcer spoke her name, the lights in the hall dimmed, and the murmur of the audience fell into breathless silence. Isabella walked out one step at a time on still healing legs, her posture straight, her presence quiet but commanding. The silver microphone gleamed beneath the spotlight. The intro began. Her opening song was Someone to Watch Over Me. It wasn't the safe choice, but it was the only one that carried everything she wanted to say. When she began to sing, A stillness rippled through the room, not of surprise, but of recognition, as though every soul there had brushed against something tender and forgotten. Her voice was no longer the youthful tone captured in old recordings. Now every note carried traces of tears, of pain endured, and of gratitude for the man sitting in the front row, his eyes never leaving her. With each phrase, she told her story not through words, but through a resonance that only a heart once broken could truly understand. The second song, then the third, drifted by like a dream. Isabella barely looked at the crowd, glancing only occasionally toward the front row where Vincent sat, silent and proud. Whenever her voice trembled, he smiled. Whenever she hesitated, he nodded once, calm and sure it was enough. The night ended with at last the song that had carried her through fear and brought her here. When the final note dissolved, the room held its breath for one long beat before the applause burst forth. It wasn't polite applause. It was recognition. It was warmth. It was a welcome back to a world she had once believed forever lost. She bowed, tears blurring her vision. As she stepped off the stage, the first person she saw was Vincent. He was waiting, wordless. Isabella went straight into his arms, not caring about her makeup or the cameras flashing in the distance. "I did it," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice breaking. "You said I would, and I did." Vincent pulled her close, his voice low and steady. "You did better than that. You didn't just sing, Isabella. You came alive, and there's nothing more beautiful than that." She drew back, looking up at him through a shimmer of tears. "Thank you for everything, for believing in me, for staying." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'll always be here. Every time you sing, I'll be the first to listen." Isabella smiled. For the first time in years, unburdened by fear. That first performance wasn't just a concert. It was a beginning, a new chapter of a life rebuilt through music, but sustained by love. That night, as they drove back to the penthouse, the city of New Orleans still shimmered beneath them, alive with lights, laughter, and distant music. Yet inside the car, there was only quiet anticipation. Isabella leaned her head back against the seat. She was still in her stage gown, her hair slightly tousled, her eyes bright, her lips curved in a soft, lingering smile born of the night's triumph. Vincent said nothing on the way home. His hand rested lightly on her leg, not possessive, not demandingly, a silent reminder that he was there, listening even to the emotions she could not yet name. When the car stopped under the familiar building, Vincent stepped out, walked around, and opened the door for her, offering his hand the same way he had the night they first met in that dark alley. But this time, when Isabella placed her hand in his, she held on tighter, not for balance, but for closeness. They entered the elevator without a word. Only the quiet rhythm of their hearts filled the spaces, synchronized, steady, and trembling with something unspoken. When the door to the apartment opened, Vincent switched on the light. The warm golden glow fell softly across the wooden floor, making the place feel more like home than anywhere Isabella had ever been. She stood in the middle of the room, turned to him, and whispered, her voice fragile yet alive. "Tonight, I feel like I'm truly living again. Like everything that was ever taken from me, I finally have it back." Vincent stepped closer, his gray-blue eyes reflecting the calm vastness of night. "You didn't just take it back," he said quietly. "You created something new, stronger, brighter." Isabella looked up at him, hesitation flickering in her eyes. And then, as if a decision had quietly settled in her heart, she reached for the lapel of his jacket. "Vincent," she said softly, her voice filled with trust, "I want a night to be more than just the night I return to music. I want it to be the night I truly belong to you." Vincent searched her face for a long time, as if making sure her words came from truth, not from the intoxication of applause or the lingering euphoria of the stage. When he saw the certainty in her eyes, he nodded gently and lifted her chin. "I've waited for this moment," he murmured. "But only when you were truly ready," Isabella answered. Not with words, but by leaning and closing the distance between them with quiet certainty. Their kiss was not hurried nor wild. It was a slow unfolding of all the feelings that had long been waiting to find their shape. In that silence, what passed between them was not desire alone, but recognition. Two souls meeting again after being lost for too long. Later, when the night grew still, They lay together in the warm light spilling through the curtains. Isabella rested against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Vincent's arm was around her, his hand tracing slow circles across her back, the way one might touch something too precious to be real. "I love you," he whispered, voice roughened by tenderness. "Not because you're strong, not because you sing, but because of everything you are." Isabella lifted her eyes to meet his, her own voice, trembling with truth. "And I love you." Long before I had the courage to admit it, he smiled. Then one of those rare smiles that softened every edge of him. And in that quiet moment, Isabella realized there were no walls left between them. The darkness that had once haunted them both was gone, replaced by the steady glow of something lasting. They drifted into sleep, wrapped in each other's warmth, not as two broken people, but as two hearts that had finally found home. A week later, Isabella moved into Vincent's penthouse. There was no formal proposal, no long discussion. It simply happened naturally, as if every step of their journey had been leading here. She brought a small suitcase, a few books, some clothes, and a folder of old song drafts. Vincent cleared space in his closet without being asked, installed a small piano in the living room, and watched with quiet satisfaction as she arranged her belongings beside his. For the first time in her life, Isabella Martinez had a home that felt like hers. Not because she owned it, but because she was wanted there, completely and without conditions. Vincent had given her more than shelter or protection. He had given her a place to heal, to grow, to become the woman she was meant to be. And she, in return, had given him something he had never thought he deserved. Love without fear, trust without hesitation, and a voice that could carry both their stories towards something brighter. They were not perfect. They carried scars, both visible and hidden. But together, they had built something stronger than perfection. They had built forgiveness, acceptance, and the quiet courage to believe in tomorrow. In the evenings, Isabella would sing softly at the piano while Vincent read nearby. On weekends, they walked through the French Quarter, her hand in his, no longer hiding from the world, but standing together in the light. The nightclub where she had once performed for spare change became the place where their love story had begun. The alley where she had almost lost everything became a memory they had overcome together. And the stage where she now sang to sold-out crowds became a symbol of what was possible when someone believed in you completely. The story of Isabella and Vincent was not just about rescue or redemption. It was about two people who had chosen each other, again and again, through every difficult moment and every small victory. It was about love that grew not in spite of darkness, but because of how they had faced it together. 2 years after the cold alleyway that had once defined her fate, Isabella Romano stood by the wide windows of their sunlit penthouse, watching New Orleans sink gently into evening. Streetlights flickered on. Car horns echoed faintly below. Each sound, each light carried a whisper of the life she had once lived, a life that felt distant now, though in truth it had only been the blink of an eye. Behind her, Vincent sat in an armchair, reading that morning's newspaper, her name printed boldly across the front page. Yet what filled him with pride wasn't the headlines or the praise. It was the woman standing there, the woman who had once fallen, who had once feared, who had once lost her voice, and who had risen again, step by step, note by note, breath by breath, until she could once more stand in the light. Isabella turned to him, her eyes filled with something deeper than love. She crossed the room, sat beside him, and took his hand. "I was just thinking," she murmured, "about everything we've been through." Vincent looked at her for a long time, his gaze no longer carrying the chill the world associated with his name. It was warm, tender, and full of words that didn't need to be spoken. "I used to think," Isabella continued softly, "that I was nothing but the broken pieces of an old dream. And then you came, not as some perfect savior, but as someone who looked at the pieces and believed they could still form something beautiful." Vincent nodded, his voice low. "Because I always knew you never lost your light. We just needed a chance to find it together." They fell silent for a while until Isabella rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "We built something beautiful." And they had a home, a faith, a life neither of them had ever believed they deserved. Their love had not begun in perfection, but in pain and choosing not to abandon each other when everything seemed shattered. What they had built could not be measured by wealth or defined by simple words. It was redemption. It was healing. It was family. The story of Isabella and Vincent was not just a love song between a young singer and a man once feared. It was proof that even in the darkest night, sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to walk away to keep the light alive. Life will always bring loss, moments that make us want to surrender. But what matters most is whether we still have the courage to open our hearts. Let someone in to believe once more that love can heal. And sometimes the most beautiful thing we ever find is not at the peak of triumph, but in the quiet place where pain once lived. Dear listeners, the story of Isabella and Vincent has touched millions because it speaks a simple truth. That love can begin in the ruins and still save what seemed beyond repair. And you, after hearing their story, what stirred in your heart? Have you ever stood in the dark waiting for someone to reach for your hand and whisper, "I'm here"? You're not alone. Tell us your story in the comments below. Share your thoughts with us so that we and everyone listening can reflect, understand, and feel together. If this story has touched you, if you wish to keep hearing heartfelt journeys and healing stories filled with humanity, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those you love. Every single subscription, every single share is what keeps us inspired to continue spreading kindness and compassion to more people around the world. Thank you for spending your precious time listening to this emotional journey in its entirety. We hope you'll stay with us for the next videos. Stories that reach deep into the heart and remind us of the beauty still left in this world. Wishing you and your loved ones good health, peace, and joy in every day. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next. 6 months after Isabella Romano's triumphant debut at the Lumiere Jazz Club, her voice had become the sound of New Orleans nights. Her album, recorded in Vincent's private studio and produced by the most sought-after names in the industry, climbed the jazz charts with a velocity that surprised even the most optimistic predictions. Critics called her voice haunting, authentic, a sound that carried the weight of lived experience. But with success came visibility, and with visibility came danger. Vincent had always known this day would come. The Torino family, his most persistent rivals, had been watching, waiting, looking for any weakness in his armor. And Isabella, with her growing fame and her obvious place in his heart, had become exactly that, a target wrapped in silk and spotlights. The threat arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a single photograph slipped under their penthouse door. Isabella, walking into the recording studio, unaware that she was being watched, cataloged, studied. On the back, 5 words in block letters that made Vincent's blood turn to ice. "We know where she sings." Vincent found Isabella in the music room, seated at the piano, her fingers moving over keys in a melody that seemed to flow from some deep well of contentment. The morning light caught the simple gold band on her left finger, the engagement ring he had given her just 2 weeks prior. She looked up when he entered, her smile fading as she saw the photograph in his hand. "What is it?" she asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. Vincent sat beside her on the piano bench, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "The Torinos. They're making a move." Isabella took the photograph, studied it with the same calm that had carried her through every crisis since that night in the alley. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "What do they want?" "Me," Vincent said simply. "And they think you're the way to get to me." For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city 42 floors below. Then Isabella set the photograph aside and turned to face him fully. "So what do we do?" The simplicity of that we hit Vincent like a physical blow. Not what do you do, not how do I stay safe, but what do we do? Even now, even faced with the reality of his dangerous world, she was thinking of them as a unit, a partnership, a team. "We disappear for a while," he said. "I have a place in the mountains, completely secure. You take a break from performing, we let things cool down." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the keys of the piano. "Vincent," she said finally, "do you remember what you told me the night we met? That I was under your protection." He nodded. "Well, now you're under mine too." She looked up at him, her dark eyes fierce with determination. "I'm not running from them. I'm not hiding. And I'm certainly not going to let them think they can control my life by threatening me." Vincent felt something shift in his chest, pride mixed with terror. "Isabella, this isn't the same as facing down Harrison Blackwell. These are killers. I know exactly who they are, she said quietly, which is why we're going to handle this the smart way. The plan Isabella proposed was audacious in its simplicity. If the Torinos wanted to use her against Vincent, then they would give them the opportunity. But on their terms, with their rules, in a place of their choosing. The trap would be irresistible. Isabella Romano, alone and apparently vulnerable, at her most high-profile performance yet. The venue was perfect for their purposes. The Monteleone Hotel's rooftop ballroom, 14 floors above the street, with only 2 access points and sight lines that Vincent's security team could control completely. The occasion was Isabella's engagement announcement, a private concert for 200 of New Orleans elite. An event the Torinos couldn't ignore and couldn't resist. Vincent spent 3 days turning the elegant ballroom into a fortress disguised as a party. Security cameras hidden behind floral arrangements. Armed men in waiters' uniforms. Bulletproof glass installed behind silk drapes. Every detail planned, every angle covered, every possibility anticipated except one. Isabella was in the hotel's bridal suite, preparing for the performance, when the lights went out. The blackout lasted exactly 90 seconds, long enough for the Torino team to disable the security system and reach the service elevator. When the backup generators kicked in, Vincent found himself staring at 3 men in the ballroom, each pointing guns at his guests, and one terrifying truth. Isabella was nowhere to be seen. The call came 15 minutes later. A voice Vincent recognized, cold and familiar. Michael Torino, the family's youngest and most ruthless son. Romano, you have something that belongs to us. Vincent's hand tightened on his phone. I have nothing that belongs to you. The territory on the east side. The shipping contracts at the port. The respect you think you've earned. All of it should have been ours after your grandfather died. You've been living on borrowed time. What do you want? Vincent asked, though he already knew. Everything. Your operations, your territory, your organization. Sign it all over, and the singer lives. Refuse, and she becomes a very public lesson in what happens to people who stand in our way. Vincent closed his eyes, his mind racing through possibilities, strategies, escape routes. Where is she? Somewhere safe. For now. You have 24 hours to decide what matters more, your empire or your woman. The line went dead. Isabella woke in darkness, her head throbbing, her hands bound behind her back. The surface beneath her was cold concrete, and the air smelled of oil and rust. Slowly, carefully, she tested her bonds and found them tight, but not impossible. Her captors had underestimated her, assuming that a singer would be helpless, delicate, easily controlled. They had never met a woman who had survived what Isabella had survived. The warehouse where they held her was old, cavernous, filled with the ghosts of New Orleans' industrial past. Through a high window, she could see the lights of the city in the distance, could orient herself enough to know she was somewhere near the river. Somewhere Vincent would look for her, eventually. But she couldn't wait for rescue. Vincent would come, but he would come expecting to trade his life's work for hers, and she couldn't let that happen. It took her 3 hours to work her hands free from the zip ties, using a piece of broken metal she found on the floor to slowly saw through the plastic. Her wrists were bloody by the time she succeeded, but she was free. Now she needed a way out, and more importantly, a way to turn the tables. The Torinos had made one crucial mistake. They had brought her to their primary warehouse, the hub of their entire operation. And Isabella, with her academic background in organized crime, recognized the value of what surrounded her. Financial records, shipping manifests, evidence of every illegal activity they conducted for the past 5 years. All of it sitting in boxes, unguarded, waiting. She found a phone in the office upstairs, its signal strong enough to reach the outside world. But instead of calling Vincent, she dialed a number she had memorized months ago during her research into the Torino family's activities. Agent Sarah Chun, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Agent Chun, this is Isabella Martinez. I'm calling about the Torino investigation. Ms. Martinez, where are you calling from? The belly of the beast, Isabella said, looking around the office filled with evidence. And I think you're going to want to see this. Vincent stood on the roof of his building, watching the sun set over New Orleans, his phone in his hand. In 6 hours, the deadline would expire. He had spent the day mobilizing every resource, calling in every favor, following every lead. and he was no closer to finding Isabella than he had been when she disappeared. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Turn on the news. Vincent grabbed the remote, switched on the television, and felt his world shift on its axis. Breaking news. FBI raids Torino warehouses across the city. Massive organized crime bust in progress. And there, in the center of the chaos, being escorted safely away from the main warehouse by federal agents, was Isabella. His phone rang. Vincent, Isabella's voice, tired but triumphant. Where are you? He demanded. Federal building. Giving my statement. The Torinos are finished, Vincent. All of them. Michael, his brothers, his father. They're looking at federal charges that'll put them away for life. How did you? Isabella laughed, the sound carrying relief and exhaustion and something that might have been pride. I remembered what you taught me. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to change the rules. 3 hours later, Vincent held her in their penthouse, her hands bandaged, her eyes bright with the aftermath of adrenaline. She told him everything. The escape, the evidence, the FBI raid. How she had turned her kidnapping into the Torino's destruction. When she finished, Vincent was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. You realize what you've done? Isabella nodded. Eliminated your biggest threat. Made the city safer. Probably prevented a war. You've also made yourself the most famous crime fighter in New Orleans, Vincent said with a rueful smile. The woman who brought down the Torino family single-handedly. That's going to make for interesting dinner conversations. Isabella laughed, the sound filling their home with warmth. I think I can handle it. After all, I've got good security. Vincent pulled her closer, marveling at the woman in his arms. Most people would have waited for rescue. She had turned captivity into victory, had protected him by destroying his enemies completely. She was extraordinary, and she was his. The wedding took place 6 months later in the garden of Vincent's estate outside the city. Isabella wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and sang her vows instead of speaking them, her voice carrying across the assembled guests like a blessing. Vincent's response was quieter, spoken rather than sung, but every word carried the weight of his absolute devotion. The reception featured Isabella's first live performance since the kidnapping, a new song she had written about love that survives in dangerous places. The lyrics spoke of shadows and light, of choosing each other despite the risks, of building something beautiful in the spaces between safety and uncertainty. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Vincent and Isabella stood alone in their garden, surrounded by the scent of jasmine and the soft glow of string lights. In the distance, New Orleans sparkled like scattered diamonds, the city that had brought them together continuing its eternal dance between music and mystery. Isabella leaned against her husband, her wedding dress pooling around her feet like spilled moonlight. Vincent's arms encircled her, strong and sure and infinitely gentle. No regrets, he murmured against her hair. None, she replied. Though I have to ask, do you think it's always going to be this complicated? Vincent considered this, thinking of his business, her career, the delicate balance they had learned to maintain between his world and hers. Probably, he said finally, but we're good at complicated. Isabella smiled, tilting her face up to look at him. We're good at a lot of things. Yes, Vincent agreed. But mostly, we're good together. Above them, the stars shone down on New Orleans, witnesses to another love story written in the language of jazz and danger, of second chances and first loves, of two people who had found each other in the dark and chosen to walk into the light together. The story of Isabella and Vincent Romano was just beginning. There would be more challenges, more triumphs, more moments when they would have to choose each other over the easier path. But they would face it all together, with her voice carrying their story and his strength protecting their future. In the months that followed, Isabella's fame grew beyond New Orleans. Record labels from Nashville and New York called with offers. Talk show hosts requested interviews. Magazine profiles painted her as a symbol of survival and strength, the woman who had turned tragedy into triumph and danger into victory. But success in the music industry meant travel, and travel meant time away from Vincent. The offers were tempting, the opportunities extraordinary, but they came with a price neither was eager to pay. The decision, when it came, surprised everyone except Vincent himself. Isabella announced her intention to establish a music foundation in New Orleans, focusing on supporting young artists who had survived trauma. She would record when she wanted to, perform when she chose to, but her primary focus would be on building something lasting in the city that had given them both their second chances. Vincent's contribution to the foundation was characteristically generous and characteristically secretive. The building that housed the foundation's studios and performance spaces appeared to have been purchased by a complex web of holding companies and charitable trusts. But Isabella knew where the money had come from, just as she knew that Vincent's legitimate businesses were slowly, carefully, taking precedence over his less legal enterprises. They were both changing, growing, becoming the people they needed to be for the life they wanted to build together. The foundation's opening night was a celebration of everything they had overcome. Isabella performed, of course, but she also introduced a dozen young artists whose voices carried their own stories of survival and hope. Vincent sat in the front row, as he always did, his eyes never leaving her, his pride evident to anyone who cared to look. After the performance, as the crowd mingled and the young artists received the applause they deserved, Isabella found a quiet moment with Vincent on the foundation's balcony. The city spread out below them, familiar now, comfortable, home in the truest sense. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if we hadn't found each other?" Vincent considered this, his arm tightening around her waist. "No," he said finally, "because we would have found each other eventually. In another place, another time, another way. Some things are inevitable." Isabella smiled, leaning into his warmth. "That's very romantic for a crime boss." "Former crime boss," Vincent corrected with a smile. "Now I'm just a businessman with excellent security. And I'm just a singer with excellent protection," Isabella added. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their city breathe and pulse with life. Vincent's businesses were increasingly legitimate. Isabella's career was flourishing on her own terms, and together they were building something that would outlast them both. The foundation would help hundreds of young artists. Vincent's transformation would set an example for others in his position. But more than that, they had proven something important to themselves and to anyone who knew their story. Love could survive in dangerous places. Trust could grow from the most unlikely soil. And sometimes, if you were very brave and very lucky, you could build a life that honored both who you had been and who you were becoming. Years later, when Isabella Romano was known throughout the country for her music and her philanthropy, when Vincent Romano was respected as a legitimate businessman and community leader, people would ask them about their love story. How had they made it work? How had they bridged the gap between their different worlds? How had they built something so strong from such a fragile beginning? The answer was always the same, whether Isabella gave it in interviews or Vincent shared it in rare moments of public reflection. They had never stopped choosing each other. Every day, in small ways and large ones, they had looked at the person beside them and decided that this was worth fighting for. This love, this partnership, this complicated, beautiful life they had built together. The story of Isabella and Vincent Romano became legend in New Orleans, the kind of story people told their children about the power of love to transform lives. But for the two people at the center of that legend, it was simply their truth. They had found each other in the darkness, had chosen each other in the light, and had built something extraordinary from the courage to believe in tomorrow. The last scene of their story, if stories ever truly end, would find them in their garden on their 10th wedding anniversary. Isabella's hair would be streaked with silver. Vincent's face would carry lines that spoke of laughter and worry and the passage of time. Around them would be evidence of the life they had built together. Their children, the artists they had helped launch, the businesses they had grown, the love they had nurtured through every season. But that evening, that perfect evening, they would be alone again, as they had been on their wedding night. Isabella would sing softly while Vincent listened, and the song would be the same one she had hummed in the hospital all those years ago. The melody that had carried her through her darkest hours and led her to her brightest days. When the song ended, Vincent would take her hand, and they would walk inside together. Two people who had learned that the most beautiful music comes not from perfection, but from the courage to harmonize despite the discord, to find the melody that makes sense of all the noise. Their love story would continue, as love stories do, in the small moments and the large ones, in the struggles and the celebrations. in the promise they had made to each other and kept through every day and every night since the moment he lifted her from that cold alley and carried her toward the light. Dear friends, this is where we leave Isabella and Vincent, not because their story ends, but because the most important chapter is the one they write together, day by day, choice by choice, song by song. If their journey has touched something in your heart, if their courage has inspired you to believe in your own capacity for love and change and growth, then their story has served its purpose. Subscribe to hear more stories that remind us of the extraordinary potential hidden in ordinary moments. Share this with someone who needs to remember that love can survive anything, can transform everything, can light the way through even the darkest valleys. And remember, wherever you are in your own story, whatever challenges you face, whatever dreams you carry, you have the same power that Isabella and Vincent discovered. The power to choose love, to choose growth, to choose the person who makes you brave enough to sing your truth to the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until we meet again in the next story, may you find the courage to write your own beautiful ending.